I walked into the hotel ballroom for my son's engagement dinner when I heard her voice cut through the crowd like a blade. "Here comes the dirty old rancher." The words hit me like a physical blow. My face burned. My hands went cold. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I wanted to leave. I wanted to disappear. But before I could turn away, my son grabbed my arm and pulled me close. "Stay calm, Dad," he whispered. "Tomorrow everything changes." What did he know that I didn't? I'm grateful you're here with me for this story. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching this right now, and what time of day is it where you are? Because when I walked into that ballroom, I had no idea my entire life was about to change. Let me tell you who I am before this nightmare began. My name is Cyrus Adams, and I've spent 65 years on a ranch in Texas Hill Country, building something real with these hands. The Adams Ranch sits deep in hill country, where the hills roll like green waves, and the vineyards stretch endlessly toward the horizon. This isn't just a cattle and grape operation, it's a legacy my father left me, carved out of dirt and sweat and stubborn determination. It's a simple life centered around honest work, but it's been the only life I've ever needed. I had 2 children. My daughter Catherine grew up and built her own life away from here. But Christopher, my boy, he stayed close. He's 32 now, a talented agricultural engineer, successful in his field. Even though he moved to the city for work, he comes back regularly. Every chance he gets, he rolls up his sleeves and works alongside me in the vineyards and pastures. That bond between a father and son, it's built on more than blood. It's built on trust. My wife Rosa was the heart of everything for 30 years. She passed 6 years ago from a sudden heart attack. It was the hardest thing I'd ever endured, but you learn to carry that kind of loss. Life teaches you how. And then a year and a half ago, Christopher met Amanda Foster. I remember that first dinner clearly. Christopher insisted on introducing her at our usual family restaurant, his way of saying this mattered. Amanda was beautiful, polished, the kind of elegant that comes from old money and older cities. She wore it well, spoke with an ease that only comes from being raised in places like New York. But something in my gut, that old rancher's instinct that's kept me alive and alert for 65 years, it nagged at me from that first handshake. The questions she asked seemed innocent enough, the way she tilted her head with interest, that practiced smile. But beneath each question was a calculation I could see as clearly as sun on the horizon. "How many acres do you own, Cyrus? That must be worth quite a bit. Has Christopher mentioned what he might inherit one day? Do you have your will set up? That's important at your age, isn't it?" She never asked what my son loved. She never asked about his dreams or his passions. She only asked about property values and inheritance, and what would eventually pass from my hands to his. Then I met her father. Thomas Foster carried himself like a man accustomed to winning his smile thin as a razor. When he shook my hand, his grip had no warmth in it, just a brief contact before he pulled away. His eyes moved across me the way a buyer might examine livestock, assessing, calculating, finding the value beneath the surface. Amanda's mother was worse, all practiced grace and frozen courtesy, her eyes sharp as broken glass behind a veneer of charm. I pulled Christopher aside afterward. "Son, something doesn't feel right about this one. She's not asking about you, she's asking about money." He smiled that patient smile young men use when they think their fathers have lost touch with the world. "Dad, I love her. You're worrying over nothing. I let it go because I didn't want to be the father who drove a wedge between his son and his happiness." But that feeling never faded. That old instinct honed across 6 decades of life on the land kept whispering warnings I couldn't quite articulate. If only I'd trusted my gut back then. If only I'd known what Amanda Foster and her family were really planning. The ballroom at the Austin Plaza gleamed with the kind of wealth that made my flannel shirt and polished boots look like relics from another century. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow across the space, and servers in black suits drifted through the crowd with trays of champagne and appetizers I couldn't pronounce. Christopher had spared no expense for his engagement celebration, and I was genuinely proud of him for that, proud that he'd grown into a man who could command a room without raising his voice. But I wasn't happy. The moment we'd arrived, something felt different. Amanda seemed almost theatrical, laughing louder than necessary, her hand perpetually on some guest's arm. Her parents held court near the bar, like royalty surveying their kingdom. Thomas Foster wore a smirk that reminded me of a rattlesnake studying a field mouse. I stood near the edge of the crowd, nursing a whiskey, trying to make sense of why I felt so uneasy. Catherine found me there, squeezed my arm knowingly, She'd never trusted Amanda either. We shared a look, the kind that happens between siblings who know their father without words needing to pass between them. That's when I heard it. Amanda's voice cut through the ambient chatter like broken glass. She was speaking to her mother near the dessert table, her words meant to be private, but carried on the acoustics of that pretentious space straight to my ears. "Here comes the dirty old rancher again," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "I swear every time he appears, the whole room smells like cattle and soil. How does Christopher even tolerate him?" The words landed like a physical blow. I felt my face flush, the whiskey glass suddenly heavy in my hand. Around me, several people had gone quiet. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in their shoes. The insult wasn't just directed at me, it was performed for the room, a public announcement that she saw me as beneath her, an embarrassment to be endured. My chest tightened. Not with shame, that came later. First came the anger. Raw, primal anger at this woman who'd played my son so perfectly, who'd stood in my home and asked questions about inheritance while pretending to care about Christopher. The anger that comes when you realize your warnings were dismissed, when you understand that your instincts were right all along, but no one listened. I set down my glass with deliberate care and turned toward the exit. I couldn't stay in that room another second. Couldn't stand to watch her perform this engagement, couldn't witness my son beside someone who mocked him and his family. But before I could take a step, a hand gripped my shoulder. Christopher. His face was calm, but his jaw was clenched tight, and his eyes burned with something I'd rarely seen in my son, cold certainty. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice steady as bedrock, "I need you to stay. I can't," I started. "You can, and you will." He leaned closer, his words barely above a whisper. "Because tomorrow, everything changes. Amanda and her father think they've won. They think this engagement is real, that they're about to lock down everything they want. But they're wrong." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, who I'd taught to work hard and speak truth, and I saw something in him that made me pause. Not a plan I understood, not an explanation I could follow. Just absolute unwavering confidence. "Trust me," he said. And I did. For 65 years I'd learned to read people. I'd gambled on instinct before, and my gut had always guided me true. But standing there in that ballroom with Amanda's cruelty still ringing in my ears, I made a choice. I chose to believe in my son. I chose to believe that somehow impossibly he knew something I didn't. The morning sun barely filtered through Christopher's apartment windows when I arrived. My body still carried the weight of last night, the humiliation, the anger, the uncertainty. I'd spent the night in my room at the hotel, staring at the ceiling, replaying Amanda's words on endless loop. When Christopher had called, his voice sounded different. Not like my son asking for advice, like a man with answers. "Dad," he'd said simply, "come to my place. I need you to hear something." I'd expected him alone. Instead, when I walked in, a younger man I'd never met sat at Christopher's kitchen table, his laptop open, surrounded by audio equipment I couldn't identify. Headphones, cables, things that looked like they belonged in a recording studio. "Dad, this is Tyler Coleman," Christopher said, his hand moving to my shoulder. "He's a sound engineer. He's been helping me piece this together." Tyler nodded respectfully, but said nothing. He understood that what was about to unfold required silence, first explanations, later. Christopher took a breath. "For the past 3 weeks before the engagement party I've been recording," my stomach dropped. "Recording what?" "Amanda and her father, their conversations, their plans." Christopher's voice remained steady, but I could see his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the laptop. "Dad, I need you to listen to something." He pressed play. Amanda's voice filled the room, crisp and clear through the speakers. "I married him for the land, nothing else. Once we get the deed in my father's name, we'll disappear. We'll reinvest everything into our NYC development projects and never look back at this God-forsaken ranch." The words landed like shrapnel. My daughter-in-law, the woman who'd kissed my cheek at family dinners, who'd smiled in wedding planning photos, had just confessed to using my son as nothing more than a stepping stone to theft. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe properly. Christopher moved to the next file without waiting for my reaction. He understood that processing this would take time. Thomas Foster's voice came next, confident and calculating. "That land is worth $2.5 million right now, but the government approved the interstate expansion last month. In 2 years, that property will be worth $25 million, maybe more. Cyrus Adams has no idea what's sitting on his ranch. Amanda's voice again, harder this time. That's why the marriage has to work for 2 years minimum. I can't stand that filthy little town, or that old man for one more second than I have to. But yes, it's worth it. I had to grip the table. My son watched me carefully, giving me space to absorb the magnitude of what I was hearing. The deliberation, the greed, the calculated contempt. There's more, Christopher said quietly. Hours more, but you understand now. I looked at my son, really looked at him. This young man I'd watched grow from a boy helping me mend fences into someone capable of something like this. The courage it must have taken, the patience. Is this legal? I asked, my voice hoarse. Completely legal, Tyler interjected for the first time. Texas is a one-party consent state. Christopher was part of these conversations. Recording them is entirely within the law. Christopher leaned forward. Dad, I know this is a lot, but we have everything we need now. We have proof of their intent to defraud you. Proof of the conspiracy between them. Proof that they're willing to use me to steal our legacy. So what do we do? I asked, though part of me already knew. Part of me had known since last night when my son promised me that tomorrow everything would change. We show them tomorrow. We show everyone. Christopher's jaw set firm. At the wedding, they'll stand before 200 people and reveal who they really are. I looked at the laptop screen, at the files waiting to be opened, at the evidence my son had methodically gathered, while I'd been blind to what was happening right in front of me. My hands trembled not from fear, but from a mixture of fury and something else entirely. Something that made me look at my son with an intensity I'd never quite felt before. When do we do this? I asked. I didn't sleep that night. The hotel room felt too quiet, too still. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed those recordings. Amanda's cold confession, Thomas's calculations about millions of dollars, the casual cruelty in their voices as they discussed dismantling everything I'd built. At 2 a.m., I stopped trying to rest. I sat in the darkness, staring out at the Austin skyline, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I talked to Rosa. My wife had been gone for 4 years now, but there were still moments, usually the most difficult ones, when I needed to feel her presence again. This was one of them. Rosa, I whispered into the darkness, help me through this. Our son needs us now. He's trying to protect what we've built together, and I'm terrified I'm going to fail him. I could almost hear her voice steady, sure the way it had been in life. You won't fail him. You're his father. He's your son. That's all that matters. Rosa had always been the strong one in our marriage in a quiet way. While I managed the ranch with my hands, she'd managed our family with her heart. She'd known somehow that Christopher would be the kind of man who wouldn't let injustice stand. She'd raised him that way, to be honest, to be brave, to stand up for what mattered. God, I missed her. As dawn broke over the Texas hills, I forced myself to get ready. I put on the suit Christopher had helped me pick out weeks ago, back before any of this darkness had surfaced. The fabric felt stiff, uncomfortable. I wasn't used to wearing anything this formal. But today wasn't about comfort. Today was about bearing witness. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back, not because of the suit, but because my eyes carried something they hadn't held in years, the weight of knowing something others didn't, the burden of a secret about to detonate. In the bathroom, I locked the door and did something private. I knelt down, even though I wasn't a particularly religious man, and I prayed. Not for safety or success. I wasn't naive enough to think this would go smoothly. I prayed for clarity. I prayed that the truth would be undeniable. I prayed that my son would be protected, that justice would actually mean something. When I arrived at the venue that morning, the space was already buzzing with activity. Florists arranging white roses along the aisle. Staff setting up champagne stations. Everything pristine, everything perfect, a facade of celebration built on a foundation of lies. And there, positioned discreetly behind the altar, was a large screen. To any other guest, it would look like one of those modern touches, a display for showing photos during the ceremony, a projection of the couple's love story, something romantic and contemporary. I knew better. In just a few hours, that screen would become the instrument of truth. Everything we'd prepared for, everything Christopher had sacrificed time and energy to orchestrate, would unfold from that moment forward. The real question wasn't whether we were ready. It was whether Amanda and her father had any idea what was coming. The ceremony began at noon. Amanda descended the aisle like she'd stepped directly out of a fairy tale, all flowing white silk and calculated grace. Her father walked beside her, his hand proprietary on her arm, his smile that of a man who believed he'd already won. The guests rose to their feet, and I watched the room fill with genuine smiles, genuine tears. They had no idea what was about to unfold. I sat in the front row, Catherine beside me, her hand finding mine. She squeezed it gently. "Stay strong," that squeeze said. "It's time." Christopher stood at the altar in a tailored suit, his expression calm, but his hands steady, the hands of a man who'd made peace with what he was about to do. Next to the priest stood a man I didn't recognize at first glance, a distinguished gentleman in his 50s with sharp, observant eyes. He sat quietly among the other guests, watching everything, saying nothing. I would learn later that this was Paul Reynolds, a prosecutor, but in that moment he was just another witness. The priest began with the traditional words. The venue smelled of flowers and expensive perfume. Soft music played from hidden speakers. Everything was exactly what a wedding should be. Everything except the truth. "We gather here today," the priest intoned, "to witness the union of Christopher Adams and Amanda Foster in the bonds of holy matrimony." Amanda's smile was radiant, confident, a woman who believed she was exactly where she needed to be, about to achieve exactly what she wanted. The priest continued with the blessings, the readings, the traditional elements of a ceremony designed to celebrate love and commitment. But every word felt hollow, now knowing what I knew. Every gesture, every smile felt like performance. And then came the moment. "Christopher Adams," the priest said, turning to my son, "do you take this woman to be your wife, to have and to hold, to love and to cherish in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" The room held its breath. This was the moment Amanda had been waiting for, the moment her parents had orchestrated, the moment when my son would say yes, and his fate and mine would be sealed into legal binding. Christopher took a breath. I watched his chest rise and fall. I watched him look directly at Amanda, and I saw something in his expression shift. A moment of genuine sadness, perhaps, for the woman she'd pretended to be. Then he turned to face the gathered crowd. "Before I answer," Christopher said, his voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the venue, "there's something everyone needs to see." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Amanda's face went pale. Thomas Foster stood up from his seat, his expression transforming from confidence to something closer to alarm. "What are you doing?" Amanda hissed, but her voice was lost in the growing whispers of the crowd. The priest looked bewildered. "I'm sorry, what?" But Christopher wasn't looking at the priest anymore. He was looking at the screen behind the altar, the screen that had seemed so innocent just hours before, like nothing more than a romantic photo display. A light flickered. The screen came to life. My heart seized in my chest. The moment had come. Everything we'd waited for, everything we'd prepared for, was about to become real. I felt Catherine's grip tighten on my hand so fiercely it almost hurt. Around me, guests leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening. Thomas Foster's face had gone from alarm to genuine panic. He grabbed Amanda's arm and began pulling her toward the exit, but the aisle was blocked by curious guests standing up from their seats. Everyone needs to hear the truth about Amanda Foster and Thomas Foster," Christopher announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "And it's all right here." The screen glowed brighter, waiting to reveal its contents. I realized I was holding my breath. The screen blazed to life. Amanda's voice filled the ballroom before anyone could process what was happening. Clear, unfiltered, devastating. "I married him for the land, nothing else. Once we get control of the deed, we'll push him out and disappear. He'll never know what happened." The words hung in the air like a poison gas, suffocating the celebration that had seemed so promising just moments before. For a heartbeat, the room went completely silent. Then it erupted. Guests who had been crying happy tears moments before now gasped in unison. Some stood up immediately, their faces twisted in disgust. I heard someone near me whisper harshly, "Liar. Absolute liar." Another voice louder, "How could you—" Amanda's face drained of all color. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could get a word out, the video continued. This was no edited snippet. This was clear, deliberate, unmistakable proof. Thomas Foster appeared on the screen next to his daughter. "That land is worth $2.5 million right now," he said, his businessman's tone crisp and certain. "But the government approved the interstate expansion last month. In 2 years, that property will be worth $25 million, maybe more. Cyrus Adams has no idea what's sitting on his ranch." Amanda's voice again, harder this time. That's why the marriage has to last at least 2 years. I can't stand that filthy little town or that old man for 1 second longer than necessary. But yes, it's worth it. The second wave of reaction was even more violent than the first. A woman near the back actually screamed. Several guests grabbed their phones, recording their expressions, oscillating between horror and vindication, as if they couldn't believe what they were witnessing, but absolutely believed every word. She's a monster, someone spat. Amanda tried to push forward toward the screen, her white dress sweeping across the marble floor. It's edited. It's fake. Someone manipulated. But her words were drowned out by the murmuring crowd. Thomas, meanwhile, had gone from pale to actively panicked. He bolted from his seat, pushing past confused guests, clearly trying to reach the control panel for the screen. He never made it. Before he could get 10 feet, the projection locked down completely. Tyler Coleman, Christopher's engineer, had anticipated this exact moment. One keystroke and the screen was no longer responsive to any manual override. Thomas's hand fell uselessly as he stared at the controls that no longer obeyed him. The third video played, Amanda's voice intimate and conspiratorial, will convince Christopher to put his father in a nursing home, somewhere far away. He'll never understand what happened. He'll just fade away thinking his son abandoned him. That's when I felt something shift inside me. Not shock anymore, I'd already absorbed the magnitude of their betrayal when I heard these recordings in Christopher's apartment. But this was different. This was public humiliation. This was my family's secrets. My vulnerability being weaponized against me in front of 200 people. And yet, when I looked at my son standing calmly at the altar, I felt something I hadn't expected, pride so fierce it almost hurt. A man stood up from the guest section. Tall, distinguished, his movement deliberate and authoritative. It took me a moment to recognize him as the prosecutor I'd seen sitting quietly throughout the ceremony. I am Paul Reynolds, he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, District Attorney for Travis County. What I have just witnessed is conspiracy to commit fraud, document forgery, and grand theft. All parties involved are under arrest. The room froze. Police officers in uniform appeared from the side exits almost immediately. They'd clearly been briefed and positioned in advance. They moved with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing. One officer approached Thomas, who tried to run, and was quickly restrained. Another moved toward Amanda, who had sunk to her knees, her white dress pooling around her like a collapsed dream. Amanda was sobbing now, her composed facade shattered completely. "This isn't fair," she kept repeating. "This isn't fair." But it was fair. It was more than fair. It was justice. Guests were now actively leaving, some shaking their heads in disgust, others lingering to watch the spectacle unfold. The ballroom, which had been filled with celebration just minutes before, had transformed into something else entirely. A crime scene, a courtroom, a monument to the consequences of greed and deception. As the officers led Thomas and Amanda toward the exits, handcuffs glinting under the ballroom lights, I locked eyes with Christopher. He was still standing at the altar, perfectly composed, his expression carrying neither triumph nor satisfaction, just clarity. The clarity of a man who had done what needed to be done. My son had protected our family. He had exposed the truth. He had activated justice, not through revenge, but through evidence, through preparation, through courage. And now, as the woman he'd almost married was being led out of the ballroom, in handcuffs, as the man who'd plotted to steal my legacy was being read his rights. As 200 guests stood in stunned silence, I knew we were finally safe. 2 weeks later, I sat in the Travis County Courthouse, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for what I'd waited for my entire life without knowing it. Vindication. The preliminary hearing had been brief. Prosecutor Paul Reynolds presented the evidence, methodically, audio recordings, authenticated by experts, proving without question that these were genuine conversations, not edited fabrications. Documents were analyzed, revealing forged signatures and falsified transfer papers. Bank records showed money being funneled from a development company straight into Thomas Foster's accounts, with Amanda listed as a beneficiary, on draft proposals that were never meant to be legitimate. The judge had little choice. Sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial, he'd stated, banging his gavel with finality. But the real reckoning came 2 weeks after that. The main trial was packed. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and the particular silence that only legal proceedings can create. Christopher and I both testified, recounting how we'd discovered the conspiracy, how Christopher had made the recordings, how the evidence had unfolded at the wedding, Our voices were steady throughout, but I noticed my son's hands trembled slightly when he described Amanda's confession about putting me in a nursing home. Paul Reynolds was relentless in his presentation. He walked the jury through every piece of evidence like chapters of a book they couldn't ignore. The recordings were played again, clearer now, with expert testimony confirming their authenticity. The documents were displayed with forensic analysis, showing the specific techniques used to forge my signature. The money transfers were traced with precision, revealing a pattern of financial manipulation that extended back years. Then something unexpected happened. A woman stood to testify. Sarah Chapman. I recognized her name from the prosecutor's preliminary files, but I hadn't expected to see her in person. She was composed, dignified, and her story was chilling. Amanda Foster and her father approached my fiancé 3 years ago, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion beneath it. They proposed the same scheme of fake marriage, a transfer of his family property, then disappearance. My fiancé refused, but they were persistent. I'm grateful that what they attempted with Christopher Adams finally exposed what they'd been doing to others. The courtroom held its breath. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. On every count: Thomas Foster, conspiracy to commit fraud, document forgery, grand theft, 10 years in federal prison. Amanda Foster, conspiracy to commit fraud, accomplice to document forgery, grand theft, 8 years in federal prison. When the judge announced the sentences, I felt something shift inside me, not triumph exactly, but completion. A wound that had been bleeding for weeks suddenly began to close. I looked at Christopher sitting beside me, and I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen since this nightmare began. Peace. The courtroom began to empty. People filtered out slowly, some shaking their heads, others speaking in hushed tones about the audacity of the scheme, the boldness of the execution, the precision of the evidence. Paul Reynolds approached us, extending his hand to both Christopher and me. "You two did good work," he said simply. "Not many families would have had the courage to do what you did. To record, to document, to stand up publicly. Most people would have tried to handle it quietly, privately, but that would have let them continue the pattern." I shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Prosecutor Reynolds, for believing us, for seeing this through." He nodded. The evidence was undeniable. Once I heard those recordings, there was no other path forward. As we walked out of the courthouse into the Texas sunlight, I turned to Christopher and really looked at him. My son, the man, he'd become the protector of our family's legacy. "We did it," I said. "We did," he agreed. "Now comes the harder part." I looked at him confused. "Harder? How could anything be harder than this?" Christopher smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a genuine smile. "Figuring out what comes next, Dad, for all of us." 3 months after the verdict, Christopher came to me on a morning when the Texas sun was just beginning to paint the hills gold. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying a certainty I'd learned to trust, "I'm not going back to the city. This is where I belong, with you, with the land." I wanted to tell him I already knew. A father recognizes these decisions in his son's eyes before words are ever spoken. But instead, I simply nodded and clasped his shoulder, feeling something inside me settle into place. The months that followed were unlike anything I'd experienced in years. Christopher threw himself into the work of the ranch with a focus that surprised even me. But more importantly, he wasn't alone. Sarah Chapman, the woman whose testimony had helped seal the prosecution's case, began spending time at the farm. What started as gratitude evolved into something deeper. I watched them together, talking over coffee on the porch, working side by side in the vineyard, laughing at some private joke, and I realized that sometimes justice doesn't just restore what was stolen. Sometimes it creates something entirely new. 6 months after that first conversation, they were married. It wasn't the elaborate affair Amanda had orchestrated. There was no crystal chandelier, no pretense, no hidden agendas masquerading as celebration. Instead, there was a simple ceremony under the old oak tree that had stood on this land for 100 years. Family and close friends, words spoken with genuine meaning, a blessing that felt real because it was real. After the wedding, something magical happened. Christopher and I began working the ranch together in a way we hadn't since he was a teenager. He brought knowledge from his years away, modern irrigation techniques, sustainable farming practices, equipment that made the work less backbreaking but no less meaningful. I brought knowledge accumulated over 6 decades, the rhythm of the seasons, the temperament of the animals, the secret language the land speaks to those patient enough to listen. We installed new water systems that turned struggling sections of vineyard into thriving rows of grapes. We modernized the cattle operations with technology that improved both efficiency and animal welfare. We worked side by side, father and son, restoring what we'd almost lost. Catherine visited one weekend, and I watched her walk the property with wonder in her eyes. "It's beautiful, Dad," she said, embracing both of us. "I was so scared we were going to lose this place." "We almost did," I said quietly. But then I looked at Christopher, at the land we'd saved together, at the future taking root around us. But we didn't. The farmhouse was fuller than it had been in years. Sarah brought warmth and laughter to rooms that had grown cold. Christopher brought purpose and vision. And I found myself at 65 feeling younger somehow, not physically, but spiritually. The burden I'd carried for so long had lifted. Late one evening, sitting on the porch with Christopher, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, I realized something had shifted fundamentally. We weren't just a father and son who'd survived a threat to our legacy. We were a family that had been tested and emerged stronger. The land was healing. We were healing. And somewhere in that healing, we'd discovered something that couldn't be stolen, couldn't be forged, couldn't be manipulated. We'd discovered each other again. Looking back now, I realize how close we came to losing everything. Not just the land, but the trust between father and son, the integrity of our family, the belief that truth still matters. I was 65 when Amanda called me a dirty rancher. I'd lived through recessions and droughts, through losing my wife and raising 2 children alone, but nothing prepared me for the realization that someone I'd welcomed into my family had been plotting to destroy us from day one. What saved us was my son's courage to act on the truth. Christopher inherited my values and exceeded them. He took evidence and made it undeniable. He planned carefully. He exposed those who'd betrayed us. When the moment came, he didn't hesitate. Thomas offered me $700,000 to settle quietly to keep the shame private. I refused, because I learned something: you cannot negotiate with people who've decided you're expendable. You can only expose them and let justice do its work. 3 things I want to say clearly. First, if something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust that instinct. Second, family is everything. Protect it with absolute conviction. Nothing is more valuable than the people you love. Third, the truth doesn't hide forever. It surfaces. It transforms everything. Looking at my son now, at the family we've rebuilt, at the land thriving under our shared care, I know we made the right choice. We chose truth over silence. We chose family over convenience. And in the end, that choice saved us all. That's my story. That's the lesson. My name is Cyrus Adams. This is my true story. I'm sharing it because I nearly destroyed my family by ignoring red flags. Don't be like me. When someone doesn't feel right, they aren't. Here's what this true story taught me. Don't trust words. Trust actions. Amanda's promises were empty. Her intentions were poison. Chua teaches us to know people by their fruits. Don't ignore patterns. Every question revealed her agenda: money, property, inheritance. I saw it. I just didn't act. Don't settle for silence. When Thomas offered $700,000 to make it disappear, I said no. Because Chua doesn't reward silence. He rewards truth. This Grandpa Stories moment changed my family forever. But it didn't have to happen this way. If I'd listened to my gut from day one, we could have prevented it all. My son Christopher became the hero of this true story because he acted on evidence. He did what I couldn't. This Grandpa Stories experience taught me one thing: protect what matters before the threat becomes a crisis. Don't wait for Chua to intervene through chaos. Listen to his whisper in your gut now. That's my Grandpa Stories warning for you. That's my true story lesson. Learn from my mistakes so you don't have to live them.